is the tithe net or gross? Let's define these terms. Gross is your income before tax. Now in England we don't just pay tax, we pay national insurance as well to pay for the free health service. In Germany you pay tax and you also pay church tax, and a percentage of your income, unless you opt out, goes to support the local Catholic Church or the local Lutheran Church. So gross is your income before tax, net is your income after tax. The main thing to learn about tithing under the Levitical law is that it was only a tax on your assets. Only landowners paid tithes, and tithes were always food, Leviticus 27:30. You did not pay money. So people who had no assets, like farm labourers who were paid a daily wage, they paid no tithes. Fishermen paid no tithes. People in trades like carpenters and blacksmiths paid no tithes. So, as I have stated, Leviticus 27:30 says the tithe is food, it is not money. That's very important. There were also 3 tithes: the Levitical tithe, the festival tithe, and the poor tithe. Each of these tithes were 10%. Numbers 18, verses 18 to 20, and Deuteronomy 14, 20 to 29 would be the verses to look at. Now, this was a tax for Israel. Leviticus 27:34 says that God has given these laws, including tithing, for Israel. When we go to the New Testament and we look at verses such as 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, verses which talk about God liking a cheerful giver, giving is not tithing. Giving is firstly giving money, and it's a free will offering. It's something which you can choose to do or not to do. Tithing is not giving. Tithing wasn't something that's optional, something that you could choose to do or choose not to do. Tithing was food, giving was money. Giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7 was optional. Tithing under the Levitical law was compulsory. You were compelled to pay this under the Levitical laws. Furthermore, if people want to tithe today, then take account of Numbers 18:21. You can only tithe to the Levites. You can't give your tithe to anyone else. You can't give your tithe to Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was of the wrong tribe. He wasn't of Levi, he was of Judah. You can't tithe to St. Paul. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. So it was only the tribe of Levi, the Levites, who could receive the tithe. If you wish to stick to the Bible and what the Bible teaches, then look around for a Levite and pay your tithe to Levi. Today, most of the money raised by churches, in my opinion, is wasted. It goes on 2 things primarily. It goes on buildings and it goes on salaries. The main problem with buildings is that few churches share their buildings. If only the local Baptists and Assemblies of God and Anglicans and 1 or 2 small independent groups, and then a few of these strange groups who meet on Saturday, if only you had 5 or 6 or 7 of these groups sharing the same single building, then they wouldn't have to keep asking for money, because when the roof need repairing, there would be 6 or 7 groups using the building. The bill is split 6 or 7 ways. But what you have today in England, and I believe this is true of Europe as a whole, is you have churches that are now small, each of which have their own building and need to raise money, not to spread the gospel, not to support evangelists, but in most cases to pay for these half-empty buildings which are only used half a day a week. The solution is simple. Churches should share their buildings. The other demand for money which churches have today is to pay salaries. Now, I have no problem with paying money for people who are in a missionary situation. I see that in the New Testament. I see people who are preaching the gospel to the lost, and they were supported by the churches, so I have no problem with that. The problem I have today is that there are so many people who are supported by the churches. Even if the church is very small, even if that church is dying, there is this tradition that you should have one person in a church. That person is called a pastor, and that person must be supported with a free house and a free car and so on and so on and so on. Now, whilst I agree there are some godly pastors out there, I am not on these videos trying to make the claim that every pastor is a fake or every pastor is a hypocrite. Many pastors also tithe about, if they do tithe, they tithe about 3 to 5%. They don't tithe 10%. The reason for this is that they will receive a salary, a pension, a free house, a free car, usually a free phone and computer and internet connection, sometimes even school fees for their children, sometimes medical and dental insurance for their families, and sometimes even they might go on holidays, which are called preaching tours. The pastor will preach the odd sermon, and he and his family stay in a nice hotel. Now, most pastors don't pay a tithe on these free things. I've never heard of a pastor choosing to tithe on his pension or tithe on his free house and free car and so on. So in this way, many pastors avoid not only paying tithes but also paying tax. They're cheating the tax system. Now, being a tax itself, I therefore must come to the conclusion that tithing, as it's not a tax on income, it's a tax on your assets. Tithing is neither net income or gross income. Instead, tithing is a tax on your assets. When we look at the purpose of the tithe, 10 in the Bible is the number of completion. Okay, you have the 10 Commandments, for instance. But 10 is also linked as a number to this world. For instance, you have the 10 plagues of Egypt. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, you have the beast with 10 heads. So the point of the tithe is that you take something that's in the world and you take it out of the world. Do you get that? That's the point of the tithe. Think of the omer of manna, which was put into the ark in Exodus 16, verses 33 to 36. An omer is a tenth of an ephah. So there's a tithe, a tenth of an ephah, put into the ark of the covenant. And it's a symbol of salvation. Because you see, mankind fell by food. Food gives us life. If we don't have food, then we die. And mankind fell by food. So you see, Jesus Christ being the bread from heaven, John 6:58. This is what the tithe signifies. It points to Christ and salvation by Christ. And the reason why the tithe is a tenth and not a seventh or a 12th or a 15th or some other number, although remember they paid multiple tithes, they didn't just pay one tithe, there were 3 tithes. The reason why tithe is a tenth is because the number 10 signifies the world, and the tithe is taken out of the world and then dedicated to God. After Genesis chapter 4, mankind is seeking peace with God. That's the thrust, the theme of the Bible after the fall of man. From Genesis chapter 3 onwards, we go to Genesis chapter 4, mankind is seeking peace with God. How do you find peace with God? Well, peace with God is only through Jesus Christ. So when we read of Melchizedek being the king of Salem in Genesis 14:18, Salem means peace. So can you see that the tithe paid to Abraham, he later became Abraham, foreshadows Christ, i.e. peace with God. We also find reference to a tenth, as in a tenth person, one person out of 10, at Isaiah chapter 6 verse 13 and Nehemiah chapter 11 verse 1. In each of these 2 verses, the 10th person goes to Jerusalem. So again, the symbolism is peace with God. A small number of the whole, go to Jerusalem, the city of peace, to find peace with God, i.e. meaning salvation. Now remember, as I said, food, not money, sustains life. Okay, you can eat sausages and beans and cabbages, but if you try and eat gold and silver, you'll die, because gold and silver can't sustain life. So it's blasphemous to try and tithe money. That's why Jesus Christ likens himself to food. He's the bread from heaven, John 6:58. And he never once likens himself to money. Finally, the tithe wasn't voluntary. It was Israel's tax system. It was compulsory. And also, if you're a Gentile, it means if you weren't born a Jew, you can't tithe. Even Cornelius, who converted to Judaism was not allowed to tithe, because under the Levitical laws, if you were a convert to Judaism, you were forbidden to tithe. That's why we read in Acts chapter 10 verse 2 that Cornelius gave alms to the people of God, but he did not give tithes. The Gentiles were excluded from the tithing system under the Levitical law, and in passages such as Deuteronomy 26:12 and Deuteronomy 14:28 and 29, the Gentiles received tithes, they did not pay a tithe. So if you're not a Jew, then why are you paying a tithe to your Pastor Gullible in your church? Because if you wish to obey the Bible and obey Scripture, it's forbidden for you to pay a tithe. And if you want to pay tithes, you should be paying food anyway, not money. Finally, Genesis 14:24, Aner, Eshcol, Mamre, the young men who were with them, and Melchizedek paid no tithes. And Abraham only paid tithes, Abraham only paid tithes once in his life, at Genesis 14. Go to Genesis 20 verse 16 and you'll find that he paid no tithe on the 1,000 pieces of silver. The reason is simple. Abraham's one-off tithe in Genesis 14 points to Christ's one single atonement for sin that happened once in Hebrews 7:26 to 27. Thank you.